Asleep at Lone Mountain by H.D. Umbstaetter. It occurred nearly 14 years ago, yet I never enter a sleeping car without being confronted by that innocent face. It clings to me all the more because I have always looked upon partings and leave-takings as mileposts of sorrow in the journeys of life. I dislike goodbyes, I hate farewells. I had just returned from Australia and was about to start on my journey across the continent. In company with two old friends who had crossed the ferry from San Francisco to Oakland to see me off, I sat chatting in my sleeper when two sisters of mercy hurriedly entered the car. Just what it was in the appearance of the newcomers that arrested the attention of the earlier arrivals, whether it was their humble yet characteristic attire, so suggestive of charity the whole world over, the apparent anxiety betrayed by their manner, or the fact that a sleeping child, clasped tenderly in the arms of one, was their sole companion, whether it was any or all of these things that caused a sudden reign of respectful silence in the car, I am unable to say. Certain it is, however, that their coming was not unnoticed. Neither was the circumstance that the only visible baggage of the trio consisted of a small square bundle neatly done up in a gray shawl. Upon being shown to seats in the section directly opposite the one occupied by myself and friends, they at once entered into earnest conversation with the sleeping car conductor. At the first few whispered words, the man's manner showed unmistakable surprise. He appeared either unable or unwilling to comply with some request they had made. Although the nature of the request was not apparent, the occupants of neighboring seats could not fail to note from the conversation, which now and then became quite audible, that it bore some important relation to the sleeping member of the party. The evident fact that the sisters felt much concerned respecting the safety and welfare of their youthful companion served only to increase the mystery of the situation. After patiently listening for some minutes to appeals first from one and then the other, and after glancing over a railroad ticket and letter they had handed him, the conductor consented to meet their wishes, declining, however, to accept a sum of money they repeatedly tendered him. Before leaving them, the man spoke a few words of reassurance and encouragement, which were cut short by the shrill whistle of the locomotive, announcing the train's departure. The sisters arose instantly, hastily expressed their earnest thanks to the conductor, and then, sinking upon their knees before the child, which had been aroused from its slumbers and sat innocently gazing about, first one and then the other clasped the infant in fond embrace, and amid sobs and kisses, showered upon the little being the most fervent blessings and tender farewells. Then, covering their tearful faces with their hands, they arose, still weeping as though their hearts would break, and hurriedly left the car, which was already moving slowly out of the station. No sooner had they gone than all eyes were directed towards the diminutive stranger who had caused the scene just witnessed. Too young to realize what was going on, he sat motionless, as though spellbound by fear or astonishment at his strange surroundings. In an instant, the child became an object of intense curiosity. More than that, its extreme youth and utter helplessness aroused, on the part of its fellow travelers, feelings of genuine sympathy and pity, feelings which the heroic silence maintained by the little innocent, in spite of the now swiftly moving train, only served to intensify. Neither memory nor imagination can suggest to me a more touching picture than the one presented by that plainly clad handful of human loneliness, as it sat there in meek silence, its tiny hand timidly resting on the little bundle by its side, while its eyes remained intently fixed on the door which, a few moments before, had closed upon its late companions. Whose child was this? Who was to care for it? What was to become of it? Was one of the nuns a relative? Was the younger, perhaps, its sister? Or was either neither? These and similar questions could be easily read on the countenances of the wondering passengers. Some minutes elapsed before the conductor again made his appearance, when he was at once besieged with questions concerning the mysterious stranger. And, as if determined that not a word should escape their ears, each of the 12 or 15 occupants of the car crowded about him as he seated himself beside the lonely child. The story they heard was brief and pathetic. The little boy was as much of a stranger to the conductor as he was to the passengers. His mother was dead. His home was in one of the smaller manufacturing towns of New England, where his father, who was to meet him on the arrival of our train at Omaha, lived in humble circumstances. The conductor had promised the sisters to protect and care for the child during the 5 days' journey. It was, however, not the little fellow's first trip across the plains, as nearly a year and a half ago, when but a few weeks old, he had come to California with his invalid mother. The latter had survived the long journey but a very short time, and died among strangers in one of the foothill towns near San Francisco. The Sisters of Mercy of that city had by correspondence arranged with the father to adopt, or rather, to provide a temporary home for the little waif, until he should be old enough to make the long return journey. And now, although the boy had reached but the tender age of 18 months, the distant parent, craving for his presence, had begged the sister to enlist in his behalf the sympathies and care of some kind-hearted eastbound passenger or railway employee. Their repeated efforts in the former direction having failed, they had at last applied to the conductor. In relating the child's sad history, the sisters had, the conductor continued, so feelingly solicited his kindly offices and paid such glowing tribute to the almost angelic disposition and exceptional bravery of the infant that, however disinclined he had been to assume the responsibility, a persistent refusal of their unusual request seemed almost inhuman. He had therefore undertaken the strange charge, and trusted, he said, that the passengers would in no wise be inconvenienced thereby. From that moment on, everyone who had less than half an hour before witnessed the scene of sorrowful parting, which had so touchingly told how completely the little fellow had walked into the hearts of his benefactors. From that time on, everyone felt a personal responsibility for the comfort and safety of the boy. Introduced under circumstances that rendered him a hero at the outset, at the end of the first day, he had already become the pet of the passengers and the object of their kindliest attentions. While the claim that this child was remarkable for beauty and cleverness might lend sentiment and romance to my simple narrative, the fact is that he was neither handsome nor bright. In appearance, he was simply a plain, plump, red-cheeked, flaxen-haired baby boy with apparently little to be proud of, save his evident good health and a pair of large blue eyes that seemed frankness itself. His accomplishments were few indeed. He was still, as the sisters had said, learning to walk. His vocabulary included but 3 or 4 imperfectly spoken words, and he was conspicuously deficient in that parrot-like precociousness so common and frequently so highly prized in little children. But what our youthful companion lacked in attractive outwardness was more than made up by the true inwardness of one accomplishment he did possess. That was silence. This virtue he practiced to a degree that soon won for him the admiration and affection of all. Though exhibiting no sign of embarrassment at the friendly advances of the passengers, and while not unmoved by their tender attentions, he maintained through that long journey a humble air of mute contentment that lost its balance on but 3 occasions. His quiet ways were a theme of constant comment, while his presence proved not only a source of increasing pleasure to our small band of tourists, but did much to relieve the monotony of the tedious journey. One important detail in the boy's eventful history was missing. Cared for by strangers from earliest infancy, deprived of his mother's love and father's care, he had thus far not even received that all-important parental gift, a Christian name. To the sisters, he had been known simply as Baby. By that infantile appellation, he had passed from their gentle mercies to the conductor's care, and only as Baby homeward bound was he spoken of in their letter addressed to his father. Before he had spent a day among us, it was suggested that his exemplary conduct entitled him to a more dignified name, at least during the period of our companionship, and this suggestion led to one of many amusing incidents. By what name should the boy be known? After the question had been eagerly answered a dozen times in as many different ways, with apparently little hope of a unanimous choice, for everyone felt that his or her preference was peculiarly appropriate, a quiet old man, whose appearance was strongly suggestive of the pioneer days, offered happy solution of the difficulty. He proposed that, in view of the humble circumstances of the child, the privilege of naming him for the trip be sold at auction among the passengers of our car, adding, by way of explanation, that the sum thus realized might give the little fellow a start in life. The average overland tourist is never slow to adopt any expedient to relieve the tedium of the journey, and here was, as one chap expressed it, a chance for an auction on wheels, and one for charity's sake, at that. So the proposition was no sooner stated than acted upon. The auctioneer found himself unanimously elected, and placing himself in the center of the car, heard the bidding, prompted by every generous impulse that enthusiasm and sympathy can give, rise rapidly in sums of $1, $2, and $3 until 35 was called. There it halted, but only for a moment. The situation had become exciting. The auctioneer himself now took a hand in the competition, and a round of applause greeted his bid, made in the name of his native state. Ohio bids $50. It was regarded as a matter of course that this sum would secure the coveted privilege. But no, someone remarks that yet another county remains to be heard from. The voice of the weather-worn pioneer, the suggester of the scheme, has not yet been heard in the bidding. He has been a silent looker-on, biding his time. Now it has come. As he rises slowly in his seat, he is intently watched by every eye, for somehow the impression prevails that he hails from the coast, and that consequently there can be nothing small in anything he does. In this no one is disappointed. The heart and purse of the gray-haired veteran are in the cause. Besides, his pride is up. For the state he worships, almost idolizes. As his clear voice rings out with, "California sees Ohio's 50 and goes 50 better," he is greeted by a storm of cheers that he will remember as long as he lives. And when the auctioneer announces, "California pays $100 and secures the privilege of naming the boy, what name shall it be?" The answer comes back quick as a flash. "Grit, that sounds well and seems to fit well." The passengers thought so too, and very plainly showed their approval by overwhelming the man with congratulations and good wishes. Reports of our proceedings were not slow in reaching the passengers in other parts of the train, whose curiosity or compassion led to numerous daily visits, while thoughtful sympathy found expression in liberal gifts of fruit, photographs, and a variety of Indian toys, as curious as they were welcome. To the old Californian, whose great liberality had secured for him a place in the respect and goodwill of the entire party, which was second only to that held by Grit himself, these continued attentions proved a source of special delight. Though he bore his honors with becoming modesty, he found early opportunity of proposing the health of the boy, who, as he aptly expressed it, had been rocked in the cradle of misfortune, but had at last struck the color. Equally happy was his reply to a party of jolly cowboys, whom curiosity had led to solicit a peep at the silent kid, while the train was delayed at one of the eating stations along the road. Their request having been granted, one of their number felt so highly elated upon receiving a handshake from Grit that he insisted upon presenting him with his huge cowboy spurs as a keepsake, proclaiming as he did so, with a trifle more enthusiasm than reverence, that in paying $100 to nominate the cute little kid, old California carved his own name upon the Rock of Ages. "Bless his little heart," replied the grizzled miner, "I'd give 10,000 more to own him now that he has won his spurs." Among the recollections of my personal experiences with Grit, the second night of the journey stands out with a special clearness. At that time, we were passing through the famous snowshed section on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, our train running at a high rate of speed in order to make up lost time. It was here that the bravery of our little hero was put to a cruel test. Sometime after midnight, I was awakened by a child's frantic screams that rose loud above the train's thundering noise. And though up to this time there had not been a single tearful outbreak on the part of the young Trojan, there could be no mistaking the source of the piercing shrieks that now met my ears. I lost no time in hastening to his assistance, for I knew that, by way of experiment, he had been quartered in a section entirely by himself, the previous night having been a sleepless one to both the conductor and his charge. Furthermore, it was evident from his agonizing cries that I was the first to hear him. Finding the car in total darkness, the lights on both ends having gone out, I met with some delay in feeling my way to the terrified child, calling to him as I went. And at the first touch of my hand, the trembling, feverish little form drew close to me, its chubby arms closed wildly about my neck, while loud, hysterical sobs told more plainly than words can express the agony that the child had endured. Only one who is familiar with sleeping car travel over mountainous country, who has found himself suddenly aroused by the terrific roaring and swaying of a swiftly running train, and who, unconscious for the instant of his surroundings, has felt his flesh creep and his heart stand still, as he imagined himself engulfed by a mighty torrent or hurled over some awful precipice. Only such an one can realize the position of this terror-stricken child. Arousing the porter, who had gone to sleep while blacking the passenger's boots, I carried Grit to my own berth, where my endeavors to soothe his disturbed feelings proved so highly successful that the relighting of the car was greeted by him with loud laughter through the still lingering tears. But go to sleep again he would not. No matter how often I tucked him beneath the blankets and settled myself to pretended slumbers, he would as often extricate himself and, in a sitting posture, silently contemplate his surroundings. Fearing to doze off under the circumstances, I finally concluded to sit up with the little fellow until sleep should overcome him. Making his way to my side as I sat on the edge of the berth, and placing his face close to mine, he imparted the cause of his persistent wakefulness by a gently uttered "drink," repeating the word with more emphasis after a moment's pause. Happily, ample provisions had been made to meet his wants in this direction, and procuring from the porter's Baby's Bakery, as the well-provided lunch basket we had presented him at Sacramento had come to be known, I helped him to a glass of milk, after drinking which he fell quickly to sleep. After that night's experience, Grit singled me out as his particular friend, and as a consequence, he was nightly permitted to share my section with me. In these closer relations, I found him the gentlest, most loving, and best-behaved child I ever met. It seemed as though he knew and felt that he stood sadly alone in the world, and that the less trouble he gave to others, the better he would get on. His spirit of contentment and faculty of self-entertainment were phenomenal. While cards, books, conversation, and sleep served as a means of passing away time among the other passengers, he would for hours at a time remain in sole possession of a favorite corner seat, silently musing over some simple Indian toy. Again, an illustrated timetable or railway map would absorb his entire attention, until he had apparently mastered every detail of the intricate document. To watch the little toddling figure, after these prolonged periods of self-amusement, as clad in a long, loose gray gown, it quietly made its way along the car on a tour of inspection, proved an appealing study. Finding his arrival at my seat unnoticed at times, by reason of my absorption in a book or game of cards, he would announce his presence by a series of steady pulls at my coat, and make known his wants by a sweetly mumbled mum-mum. Repeated falls, incurred during these excursions, never caused him to falter in his purpose, nor did these, at any time, result in any other than good-natured demonstrations. On but one occasion, aside from that already alluded to, was he moved to tears, an unlucky incident that happened while our party was taking breakfast at Cheyenne, sadly upsetting the remarkable tranquility of his mind. We had scarcely seated ourselves at the table, with the boy, as usual, perched in a baby chair in the midst of the party, when, espying an orange that a little girl next to him had placed beside her plate, Grit, innocently unmindful of its ownership, proceeded to help himself to the inviting fruit. No sooner had he grasped it than a sharp slap from his fair neighbor's hand sent it rolling along the floor. The child started, trembled, keenly hurt in more ways than one by what was, no doubt, the first punishment he had ever received. He burst into heartrending tears. Turning to me with outstretched arms, his piteously spoken mum-mum cast a shadow over the festive occasion, and to some of us, at least, placed the further discussion of the meal beyond desire. Taking him back to the car, we were quickly joined by the conductor and our friend from the coast, who, after denouncing the outrage with frontier fluency, insisted that he should demand an apology from the offender, who was plenty old enough to know better, and whose indignity to Grit, right before a lot of strangers, was nothing short of an insult to our entire party. He would rather, he continued, fast a whole month than sit by and again witness such conduct from one whose sex and insignificance prevented a man from even drawing his gun in defense of the most helpless and innocent little creature on earth. Something in the old man's manner, as he uttered these words, left little doubt in the minds of the passengers, now returning from the hurriedly finished meal, that, had Grit's tormentor been unfortunate enough to belong to the sterner sex, the novel experience of serving on a coroner's jury in the cowboy country would doubtless have been afforded us. This tension of feeling was happily relieved, however, by the appearance of the offender in person, who, accompanied by her mother, tearfully presented not only her humble apology, but that bone of contention, the tropical product itself, which she insisted should be accepted as a peace offering. As the journey progressed, each day brought to our party frequent reminders of their constantly increasing attachment, not only for the little hero, but for each other. And it became more and more apparent, now that the Rockies had already been left behind, and our thoughts turned to the inevitable breaking up of the happy band, that Grit's presence had been the unconscious means of forming among his companions a strong bond of friendship and good fellowship, one that could not be severed without sincere mutual regrets. The morning of the last day found us still speeding over the seemingly endless cattle plains, where the frequent spectacle of immense grazing herds, guarded by picturesque bands of frolicking cowboys, added novelty and interest to the monotony of the scene. It was in the early part of the afternoon of that day, while Grit was enjoying his customary midday nap, and the final games of whist and euchre so completely enlisted our interest as to render unnoticed the locomotive's shrill notes of warning to trespassing cattle, that a sudden terrific crash, followed by violent jolting and swaying of the car, breaking of windows, and pitching about of passengers and baggage, caused a scene of consternation and suffering. Mingled with shouts of collision from men and the screams of panic-stricken women came the engineer's piercing signal for down brakes, and before the car had fairly regained its balance upon the rails and the occupants had time to extricate themselves or realize what had happened, the train had come to a standstill. More frightened than hurt, people instantly began bolting frantically for the doors, questioning and shouting to one another as they went. In the midst of the wild confusion arose cries of "Save Grit," "Look out for the baby." The words sent a shock to the heart of every hearer. Fear vanished, personal peril was forgotten for the moment, not a soul left the car, though women had fainted and men lay motionless as if paralyzed, but one thought filled the minds of those who had heard the appeal: was Grit safe? In a moment the answer to this unasked question fell from the lips of one whose intense affection for the boy he had so appropriately named needed no appeal to carry him to his side in time of peril. "The child is hurt. Somebody go and see if there is a doctor on the train." In willing response, several men rushed out among the excited throng that poured from the other cars. Before us, on a pillowed seat, to which he had just borne him, lay Grit, half unconscious, pale, limp, and breathing with painful difficulty. The sudden shock which had almost overturned the car had rudely thrown him from his bed to the floor. There, between two unoccupied seats on the opposite side of the car, we had found him, convulsively gasping for breath, one little hand still grasping tightly the Indian doll baby that for days had been his cherished companion. Though an examination of his body revealed no marks of violence, he was evidently in great pain. Applying such restoratives as were at hand, we gradually revived consciousness. Every attempt, however, to lift him or change his reclining position visibly increased his suffering. Word soon came back that no physician could be found, that the accident was caused by the train coming into collision with a band of stray cattle. So far as could be hastily ascertained, one man had been fatally injured, while many persons had sustained serious bruises and strains. From the train conductor, it was further learned that neither the locomotive nor any of the cars had been sufficiently damaged to prevent our proceeding to Omaha, still some 5 or 6 hours distant. After a brief stop for the purpose of a careful examination of all parts of the train, we were again underway, the engineer having orders, in view of the injured passengers, to make the run in the fastest time possible. The remainder of the journey was, even to the most fortunate, associated with sadness. But whatever the suffering on that ill-fated train, memory carries me back to but one sorrowful scene, the bedside about which lingered the friends of the little stranger whom we had learned to love so well. In the presence of his suffering, our own lesser injuries were forgotten, and all efforts were bent upon securing for the little sufferer every comfort possible under the adverse circumstances. With a view to lessening the painful effect of the constant jarring and shaking motion, a swinging bed was speedily improvised in the middle of the car, and here, surrounded by his sorrowing companions, lay Grit, enduring in silence the pains that his pale, sadly troubled face so keenly expressed. Late in the evening, the train reached its destination, without further mishap. It had not yet come to a standstill in the station when, accompanied by the sleeping car conductor, the father of Grit entered the car. Early in the day, it had been resolved by the passengers that 3 of their number should meet the father upon his arrival, for the purpose of exonerating the conductor from any carelessness, and also for offering their assistance in caring for the child during the night. Now, however, reminded of their former happy anticipation of the meeting between parent and child, a shudder of sadness caused them irresistibly to shrink from a scene of welcome more deeply sad, even, than that sorrowful parting which they had witnessed on entering upon their journey a few days before. As the stranger, deeply agitated, anxiously made his way to the central group, however, earnest sympathy found ready expression, and ere his eye had met the object of its search, a friendly voice checked and bade him be calm and hopeful. "Your child, sir," continued the speaker reassuringly, "has not entirely recovered from the rough shaking up we got a little while ago. He had a lucky escape, but now needs rest and quiet, and you and I had perhaps better go for a doctor, while our friends here convey the boy to the hotel, where we shall join them shortly." And as the uneasy parent bends over the little bed, and with inquiring look seeks from the calm blue eyes some token of recognition or sign of hope, the voice, more urgent, as though suddenly stirred by memories of an eventful past, again breaks in, "Let us lose no time in making the child more comfortable." A few moments later, Grit's friends stood around his bed at the neighboring hotel, listening to the verdict of the physician hastily summoned by the big-hearted pioneer. Internal injury of an extent unknown, but whose nature would probably develop before morning, was the verdict given after a careful examination. Alleviating measures, however, were suggested, which the distracted father hastened to put into effect. It was during one of his absences from the room that the big-hearted pioneer, drawing the doctor to one side, appealed to him in faltering tones to save the child at any sacrifice or any cost. But the appeal, though touching, was unnecessary. Higher considerations than those of personal gain prompted the kind doctor to exercise his utmost skill. After his first visit, not an hour passed, but what his footsteps brought to the watchers reassuring proof of his deep interest in the case. And finally, yielding apparently to the soothing remedies, Grit fell into slumber that brought encouragement to his friends, none of whom could be induced, however, to forsake his bedside. During the vigils of the night, the father was repeatedly moved to speak of the sorrows of his life, of the sudden, fatal illness of his loving young wife, and of her ardent assurance that her last thoughts were solely of himself and baby, coupled with the fervent wish that the two might some day find a home in California, where in their final rest all 3 might once again be side by side. Towards morning, the boy grew suddenly restive, and violent coughing spells brought back the condition of semi-unconsciousness of the previous day. The doctor, evidently expecting a crisis, now remained constantly at his side. The change came at last. Just after dawn, a beam of light broke softly over the little face, and new hope came to the anxious watchers. But mistaking the silent messenger's approach for the herald of returning health, they had hoped in vain. The peaceful smile lingered but a moment, then returned once again, as though the beckoning spirit was loath to quit its hold. And Grit had fallen asleep. As a token of affection for her child, and in compliance with the dying mother's wish, the friends of Grit secured for the husband and father, chiefly through the generosity of one whose deeds shall outlive the recollection of his name, a permanent home in California, while the boy sleeps by her side, where the peaceful silence he so sweetly symbolized is never broken save by the weird lullaby of the waves that gently rise and fall over the distant shadows of Lone Mountain. The end. Anderson.